Now, the next group of parasites we're going to get into are the cestodes. So we're starting to get a little bit more worm-like. These are actually known as the tapeworms. So these worms actually have little segments known as proglottids that can be diagnostic. Okay, and the head region, as I'm pointing to here, has what's called a neck, and you can see where it typically will attach. Now, cestodes are typically diagnosed either by eggs or the proglottids, the segments in the feces. And again, when humans serve as the intermediate host, like we saw in the case of the non-human schistosomes, the infections are going to be much more serious, okay, than with ingestion of undercooked pork or beef, for example. So I'm going to talk about Taenia saginata and Taenia solium. These are the beef and the pork tapeworm. You're going to acquire them from eating undercooked beef or pork, and so you're going to ingest the rare beef in the case of Taenia saginata, and the cystocerci are ingested, and then the development of the worm occurs. Humans in this case function as the definitive host, and you're going to diagnose this by finding these large proglottids in the stool or these eggs that are diagnostic. They kind of look like tires. Okay? Now the disease for saginata a lot of the times is asymptomatic. So you can have asymptomatic disease to just vague abdominal symptoms. They actually used to sell tapeworms as diet aids because they thought that the tapeworm, you would ingest the tapeworm in a little capsule or pill, and that tapeworm, they thought, because it absorbs nutrients in the intestine, would help you lose weight. You can see that didn't get very far. Okay, diagnosis again by the proglottids or the eggs in the feces, and we're going to treat it with praziquantel. Now, the only way you're going to be able to differentiate clinically between Taenia saginata and Taenia solium is going to have to be the history of what that patient ate. Because clinically, when humans are the definitive host, it looks very similar to Taenia saginata. It's when humans function as the intermediate host that it's much more complicated. Okay? So, intestinal tapeworm, similar to what we talked about with Taenia saginata, we're ingesting undercooked pork, and we ingest the cysts that develop into the tapeworms in our intestines. In the case of cysticercosis, where the humans are functioning as the intermediate host, in that case, we are ingesting eggs directly. Now think about this. The worms, typically, in this case, going into the pig. So now you ingest the eggs, and it kind of hatches, looks around, it thinks it's in a pig, and it's not. So it doesn't really know what to do. So what is very common when this happens is the larvae just kind of start to migrate around. They don't know where to go. They really don't know what to do. So they start to migrate around, and everywhere they migrate, they're typically causing inflammation. Cysticercosis can be much more severe if it goes to the brain, and you can get neurocysticercosis, which is extremely complicated. So for the intestinal tapeworm, basically the same as the beef tapeworm, but for cysticercosis, when we are the intermediate host, the larvae begin to penetrate and migrate and can calcify, and that becomes very complicated. So diagnosis for intestinal tapeworm, again, just like for the beef tapeworm, you're going to look for the eggs or the proglottids in the feces. And for cysticercosis, which again, remember, can go to the CNS, you can have neurocysticercosis, biopsy is going to be needed for the diagnosis. Now, we can treat the intestinal tapeworm with praziquantel, but cysticercosis is going to require surgery as well. All right, the next of the tapeworms is the fish tapeworm. This is Diphyllobothrium latum, and you get this from ingesting raw or undercooked fish. Now the worm itself looks a little bit different than the beef or the pork tapeworm that I showed you. You can see these very broad, thin proglottids as opposed to the proglottids that I showed you from Taenia saginata and Taenia solium. So again, you get this typically from ingesting undercooked fish. You can also become the definitive host here, but usually this is not what they ask, okay? Now, Diphyllobothrium latum actually is tested on the USMLE because it is associated with B12 deficiency. So it results in megaloblastic anemia. And again, this is the intestinal tapeworm. So the eggs hatch, the larvae migrate, they develop into worms in the intestine, and they absorb your B12. So this results in a megaloblastic anemia. One of the things they may mention in a vignette about fish tapeworm is that somebody happens to be from an area of the country or the world that is commonly associated with eating raw or undercooked fish. Now in the U.S., that happens to be in Alaska, would be a high incidence state. Worldwide, you can think Scandinavia or Japan, for example, as far as eating the undercooked fish. Now, diagnosis, you're going to look for the eggs or proglottids in the feces. Biopsy, as we talked about for cysticercosis, for sparganosis, but again, they're not probably going to ask you about this because they like to know that you understand that the intestinal tapeworm causes the megaloblastic anemia. And again, we're going to treat it with praziquantel. All right, the next of the tapeworms is Echinococcus granulosus, and the disease associated with this is called hydatid cyst disease. You see Echinococcus granulosus in areas of the world that typically still herd sheep. Now in the U.S., that is very predominant up in Utah and Idaho, for example. And in this case, you are ingesting the eggs. The larvae can go just about anywhere they want to go. And here's an example of an adult worm, okay? And the cyst, actually, here's an example of the cyst. The biggest problem with the cyst are surgical removal of the cyst. You have to be extremely careful when you're removing the cyst and trying not to break the cyst because you can risk anaphylactic shock if that cyst ruptures, okay? Inside of the cyst, if you did a cross-section here, each one of these are little protoscolices or immature worms. All right, so the disease again, hydatid cyst disease. So here's an example again of a cyst. It's typically diagnosed by imaging, probably more important than serology, and treated with albendazole and surgical removal of the cyst. Now, last on the list for the tapeworms is Echinococcus multilocularis. This is a little bit more severe than Echinococcus granulosus because in addition to forming the cysts are basically metastatic and will bud off from each other. So this one is very hard to control. You're still going to acquire it as you ingest eggs accidentally. This is, again, much more serious than Echinococcus granulosus because of the exogenous budding of the cyst. It's very difficult to diagnose and it's difficult to treat because of all the cysts. So treatment usually requires surgical resection because the cysts have basically become metastatic.